The year was 1977. Star Wars was killing the box office, Elvis had died, and Atari had just released their first home gaming system, the 2600. Originally called the Video Computer System, or Atari VCS, this early 8-bit console ran on a 1.19 megahertz processor and had only 128 bytes of RAM.
The 2600 really is my earliest memories of gaming. Staying up late, drinking root beer with friends, hating that Pac-Man game, but at the same time playing it obsessively.
When it hit the shelves, the Atari came boxed with a pair of paddles, a copy of Combat, and 2 of the classic orange button joysticks. Along with buttons for power, reset, and select, the Atari could toggle between color and black and white. And if the games were too challenging, you could switch the difficulty between A for advanced or B for beginner.
What's so interesting to look at is how you set up the Atari 2600. It looked like something out of a David Cronenberg movie, just these strange boxes you attached to the RV signal on the back of your television and these strange switches that you went back and forth.
It cost $200, which, adjusting for inflation, would now run you about $700. Despite the price tag, the console would become a household name. Popular titles included Pitfall, where you would swing on vines, jump on alligators, and avoid scorpions to snag treasure.
I remember Pitfall, and by passing off that joystick, we were able to hit that magic number. I believe it was 10,000 to join the Pitfall Harry Club, which really brought no great glamour to one's life.
Missile Command, where you could protect 6 cities from an onslaught of ballistic missiles. And the 2D shooter Space Invaders that pitted you against a wave of aliens.
That's one, when you look back, you can't figure out how it was entertaining, be it on the 2600 or in the arcade, but it was. Because you hit a button, the alien disappeared, and that was innately satisfying.
The popularity of these titles helped set the standard for cartridges, since most systems, like the Magnavox Odyssey, came pre-programmed. In 1980, Atari would earn over $2 billion and would double its sales by '82. They would go on to develop several versions of the 2600, like the wood-grained model and the streamlined all-black Darth Vader system. However, it would turn out that the Force was not so strong with Atari. Highly anticipated titles like Pac-Man and E.T. only spent 6 weeks in development and were critically panned. Pac-Man was a flickering mess, and E.T. was so bad, Atari buried millions of unsold copies in a New Mexico landfill.
The most frustrating game, I think it was Pac-Man, because I would be playing Pac-Man in the arcade, and that is not how it played or how it looked.
On top of these high-profile disasters, pornographic titles began to crop up, like Custer's Revenge, in which your objective was to molest a Native American woman. All of this culminated in the video game crash of 1983, resulting in Atari losing over $500 million and retailers pulling systems from their shelves. In 1984, Atari would try to release a more cost-effective console for $50, commonly known as the 2600 Junior, but by then, the damage was done. Although games would continue to be produced for the 2600, it would never fully recover from the crash.
Despite the quality, the actual impact at the time of the 2600, it is so important what that system did, because it suddenly made people realize that you could be playing games on your television.
Officially, the Atari 2600 was retired in 1992, making it the longest-running home gaming system, lasting 17 years.
Even though it collapsed and almost destroyed the entire industry, it also made that industry in the first place, and for that, it will always have a special place in the annals of video games.
November 1992. Bill Clinton was just elected president, grunge ruled the airwaves, and the 16-bit wars were in full swing, prompting Sega to launch their new console, the Sega CD. Created as an add-on for the Genesis, Sega CD represented a shift in gaming, as it was one of the first consoles to have full motion video and CD-quality audio.
I remember standing in the middle of a Good Guys, and there was a Sega CD on display for the first time, and I saw full motion video games being played, and it literally blew my mind. They had to get a bucket.
The first model sold for $300, had a 12.5 megahertz processor with 64 kilobits of RAM. It used a 1-speed CD-ROM, and it required the Genesis controller to play games.
It was gigantic. You actually had to stack your Genesis on top of it, and I can tell you how hard it was to get the console and video games out of my parents to begin with. So the $300 stackable thing was not going to happen.
In spite of the cost, a heavy-duty advertising campaign ensured that the system sold out in its first weeks of infancy, moving 50,000 units.
Well, Sega was very, very big. I mean, they were arguably ruling the roost with the Genesis. So when they decided to go with the CD format, it was raised eyebrows. It's like, okay, if Sega's going all in on this, then everyone else has to get in line as well.
At the time, cartridges could only hold about 8 to 16 megabits of memory, as opposed to the CD, which was over 5,000.
Before, games had just had characters speaking in beeps and bloops and text on screen, but now voice actors could really breathe life into characters.
This is ridiculous.
By 1993, Sega would release a smaller version of the system for $230, along with the game featuring everyone's favorite hedgehog speedster, Sonic.
I think Sonic CD was probably the best Sega CD game and the most popular and the one that everybody had. And it was a great game. I mean, Sonic was great back in those days.
But not all the games were great. Many titles were just interactive movies, like the Make a Video series, where you team up with a band to help them create a video.
I'm not proud of it, but I played the hell out of every Make My Music video game there was. Criss Cross had one, Marky Mark had one, NXS had one. I didn't know who NXS was, but I knew I needed to rent that video game.
Yeah, what up? This is Boy Packer, and welcome to Make My Video.
You could select the song you wanted to play, and they'd give you little tips like, I want to see squirrels, or it'd be dope if you used that fresh strobe effect, yo. And then when you were done, they would tell you that they thought your video was totally whack, or super fresh.
Despite the increase in graphics, many fans criticized the system for its high price point and its long loading times.
I mean, the cartridge, as stupid as it was, and having to blow on it, there weren't really load times on those.
I was one of those cartridge purists who was just like, what? Spin a CD? You must be mad. This is the future.
But perhaps the most infamous moment in Sega CD history was Night Trap.
So it's the early 90s, I'm a young whippersnapper video gamer, and I say, Mom, Dad, I have to have this game.
There's these girls, and they're having a slumber party. Party! And of course that means pillow fights, panties, that kind of thing. And there's vampires in it.
Then they saw somebody hanging upside down, having blood drained from their neck, and they said, What's this thing? What's this thing again? It's a video game. It's a video game. It's fine.
The ensuing controversy resulted in congressional hearings over its offensive material and would lead to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB.
When you go back and look at it, it is no worse than the PG-13 horror films that we have today.
Night Trap did nothing to help the system's image, and by 1994, new systems like the PlayStation and Sega Saturn were already in development, and game developers were ready to move on.
What an understatement.
While the Sega CD would be the most successful console peripheral, ultimately it would only go on to sell about 2.5 million units.
It was a great product at the wrong time, and that's the only problem with the Sega CD. They really tried too much too soon. I hope they remember it as just another wacky, harebrained Sega idea that unfortunately didn't take off, but provided some gamers with a hell of a lot of fun.
In 1989, the console wars had begun. The NES was king. Sega was making waves with the debut of the Genesis, and Hudson Soft would release their new system, the TurboGrafx 16. First launched in Japan as a PC engine, Hudson had intended but failed to sell their design to Nintendo as their new system. Eventually, they teamed up with the Nippon Electric Company, or NEC, to create the 16 as an alternative to the Big Two.
Between Mario and Sonic at the time in the late 80s, 90s, it was a street fight.
It was a wonderful time where no one had really considered a console war, but that's what was happening.
One of us or one of them?
Originally advertised as the first 16-bit game console, the TurboGrafx was actually an 8-bit system.
Their graphics chip was 16-bit, so what you had were fairly eye-dropping visuals for the time with the same sort of 8-bit gameplay in terms of processing power.
The 16 was priced at $200, came with a single controller that could toggle turbo settings, and was boxed with a copy of Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, an anime-based side-scroller. Initially, the system sold decently in big cities like New York and LA, but struggled to catch on in the rest of the country.
It was a weird experience because no one actually had a TurboGrafx 16. It was always a friend of a guy that somebody knows.
Game cartridges were about the size of a credit card, and the console could only physically support one D-pad.
An issue with the TurboGrafx 16 was that it had one controller port in it, which meant if you wanted to play with your little brother or your friends, you had to buy an extra peripheral.
A year after its launch, NEC released the first CD add-on, the TurboGrafx CD.
I just remember the music being so incredible and the sound effects sounding real, and that, at its time, was pretty cool.
However, its additional $400 price tag turned away most consumers.
It's one of those things that, like, yeah, we can all pretend that it's revolutionary and great, but if nobody can afford to experience it, what's the point?
Despite this, the TurboGrafx 16 would help launch several titles and cult classics like R-Type, the space adventure shoot 'em up, the brawler Fighting Street, or as it would later be known, Street Fighter, and the horror fest Splatterhouse, which due to its violent and gory nature would become one of the first games to ever receive a parental advisory. However, the TurboGrafx 16's most popular and enduring franchise would be Bonk, the side-scrolling caveman who eventually became the console's mascot.
I remember a little dude with a giant noggin, and you'd run around and you'd leap and you would headbutt things. And that was their crazy twist on the gameplay. You guys like that Mario thing, right? Where you jump and your feet kill the enemy? Well, get this. We're taking that idea and turning it on its head. Literally. I bet that was the pitch meeting.
Over the next few years, NEC would release updated models of the TurboGrafx with increased memory and speed. However, these would fail to gain any ground on Sega or Nintendo.
It didn't have the brand recognition. It was incredibly expensive. The CD peripheral was even more expensive, and it just didn't have a lot of the must-have games that drove sales of the other systems.
The TurboGrafx would only go on to sell about 2.5 million consoles in the US, compared to the Genesis and Super Nintendo, which would sell between 20 to 30 million each.
There's an easy thing that was behind the lack of success of the TurboGrafx 16. No one bought it.
Though games continued to be developed in Japan until 1999, ultimately the TurboGrafx 16 would never find its place in the US.
It did spawn a few decent games and really help champion a couple franchises, but ultimately it will be remembered as the system that you emulate on your Nintendo.
By 1996, sales of consoles were at an all-time high. The 32-bit Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation were pushing the CD format. Atari was making one last effort with the Jaguar, and Nintendo would release their new console, the Nintendo 64. Codenamed Ultra 64, this was the world's first true 64-bit gaming console, and one of the first systems to offer 3D gaming.
The Sega Saturn has come out and has kind of been bungled in terms of its marketing. And obviously the PlayStation is already out. And here comes the Nintendo 64. And it's really offering something on these 3D graphics, these polygons, this sense of explorable world.
The N64 sold for $200, was packed with a 32-bit graphics chip, 4 megs of RAM, and ran on a 64-bit processor, making it the most powerful console of its day. It was also boxed with a single controller, which drew a lot of attention due to its odd shape, buttons, and expansion slot for a memory card and rumble pack.
That was an awkward joystick. But with that said, it gave us the analog stick, and that is now a mainstay of any console controller.
The N64 would sell 500,000 units in its first 4 months and launch with 2 games, Pilot Wing 64 and the 3D version of everyone's favorite mustachioed plumber, Super Mario 64.
Mario 64 for me is probably one of, if not my favorite console game of all time.
It was revolutionary. You had a camera that never worked quite right, and it was incredibly frustrating. But at the time, it was a miracle of modern invention.
Here we go!
Game cartridges were ROM-based and could hold up to 512 megabits of memory. However, Nintendo would be the last major console to produce games in the cartridge format.
The cartridge format was very, very expensive. The disc format was very, very cheap. This was one of those big moments when Nintendo started to lose that affinity of the third parties.
This choice eventually led to many companies, like Squaresoft, leaving Nintendo to produce games like Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation. In spite of this, several games would become huge hits for the system, including the first-person shooter, GoldenEye.
If you were in college or even high school during that time and you didn't play GoldenEye, you unfortunately didn't have hands, and life must be really tough for you now.
For the longest time, you thought first-person shooter, mouse and keyboard, but really GoldenEye made it palatable and made it entertaining.
The classic brawler Super Smash Bros. And The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is considered by most critics to be the best game of all time.
Something as simple as the Z-Trigger lock and lock just once again changed how you're going to be building and designing games inside of a 3D space, and how that was copied almost instantaneously from every other game that followed.
Of course, it did have its share of missteps, namely Superman 64, in which the Man of Steel would fly through rings in a virtual world.
Superman 64 deserves every bad thing ever said about it. It was unplayable.
There's no time to waste.
I actually think it's one of the most important games of this console generation cycle, because it showed people how to make a game in the worst way possible.
Your fate will be sealed, Superman.
Over the next few years, Nintendo released several color schemes of the console and sold about 33 million units worldwide. But by 2002, the console was discontinued as Nintendo would finally give in to the CD format with the GameCube. While the Nintendo 64 would push several innovations, ranging from the analog stick to 3D gaming, Nintendo ultimately lost its foothold on the market to the PlayStation.
The N64 should be remembered for being a very, very solid system that was rather maligned at the time, but it was just a wonderful moment where there was a little bit of experimentation and that Nintendo perfection coming out on that system.
In 1999, the Sony PlayStation dominated the gaming world. Cartridges were getting one last push with the N64, while the Saturn was dying a slow death, prompting Sega to release their new system, the Dreamcast, in the US. Priced at $200, this was the world's first 128-bit console. It supported over 16 million colors and had a resolution of 640 by 480, making it the most powerful system at the time.
Make one wrong move and I'll shoot.
The graphics for the Dreamcast were nothing short of a revelation. You look at Sonic Adventure with the Orca right there behind Sonic, and there's that many different colors and that much speed that's happening. It really was a sense that we had seen the true future of where video games were going to go. Yes!
Not only was the Dreamcast the first console to have a built-in modem, but was also the first to release downloadable content, adding missions and items for titles like Skies of Arcadia and Phantasy Star Online.
Broadband is really the experience that you want for gaming. Unfortunately, the dial-up was a little slow, a little clunky, but I was there with a little keyboard. I bought a special keyboard just with a special Dreamcast plug so I could get online and talk trash with other 14-year-old kids.
Along with 4 controller ports, the system was boxed with a single D-pad that had 2 expansion slots, which many fans took advantage of with their LCD memory cards called Visual Memory Units, or VMUs.
The VMU is the greatest creation in the history of peripherals. You can call your plays on your controller so your friend next to you couldn't see what you were doing. And that was a game changer.
Stay tuned.
The system successfully sold 500,000 units in the first 2 weeks of infancy. This was aided by several launch titles like Soul Calibur and Ready to Rumble.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Ready to Rumble, I brought with me when I did Road Trip. And I was so frustrated that I couldn't beat this certain guy that I threw my controller in anger and it smashed the glass coffee table in my hotel room and broke it.
Over 700 games were released on the Dreamcast, many of them with add-on peripherals ranging from microphones to fishing rods.
You could buy a pair of maracas, virtual maracas, to play a maraca game.
While some games were ports of popular arcade titles like Crazy Taxi.
I loved Crazy Taxi. And people make fun of me for loving Crazy Taxi, but you loved Crazy Taxi too.
And the classic zombie shooter House of the Dead 2.
I don't want to die!
Many titles were a mix of the offbeat, like the experimental open-world adventure Shenmue.
It was supposed to be a living world where everybody had a set daily routine, and you were part of that world. If you want to go on missions, great. You want to get a job? Fine, drive a forklift. Are you looking for sailors? Yeah, that was actually a plot point.
Who the hell is it?
You were looking for sailors.
As pedantic or as simple as the game can sound when you explain it, to actually play that game, especially at that time, was just awe-inspiring.
Cut the crap!
However, it was titles like Project Seaman that really pushed the envelope.
Guess what we're doing over here?
You actually had a microphone that was attached to your gigantic Dreamcast controller, and you talked to this fish thing.
What's up?
but it had a person face, and it birthed itself out of this like giant nautilus.
For people like me, it taught me a lot about responsibility, because if you didn't feed that little dude in his creepy-ass face, he was going to die. And then you felt bad about that.
I'm mad at you right now.
That dude lived in your TV.
What an experiment. Let's release a microphone and let you talk to a fish. Thank you, Sega.
Baby, you rock my tank.
Despite these attempts to push the boundaries of video games, the Dreamcast would fail. Partially due to the release of the DVD-friendly PlayStation 2 1 year later. Ultimately, the Dreamcast would only go on to sell about 10 million units, compared to the PS2, which was 15 times that. In 2001, Sega would end the production of the Dreamcast only 3 years after its release.
I think the Dreamcast should be best regarded, obviously with warm memories for certain games that are on it, but more importantly, that was the end of the era when interesting things were happening on consoles. And I didn't say successful things, and I didn't say good things, but interesting things.
Don't worry, I'll take you out.
While games would continue to be developed for the Dreamcast in Japan until 2007, Sega would shift its focus to software, ending its 20-year run of producing home gaming consoles.
Were there missteps? Absolutely. But through those missteps, we actually saw their best foot forward. I love the Dreamcast. It's still my favorite console of all time.
In the mid-90s, the Genesis and SNES were coming to the end of their runs. The next generation of consoles was on the horizon, and Atari was leading the charge with their new system, the Jaguar. Launched in '93 in the test markets of New York and San Francisco, Atari attempted to advertise the Jaguar, somewhat inaccurately, as the world's first 64-bit gaming console with the slogan, "Do the math."
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
It was actually a 32-bit CPU and a 32-bit GPU that I guess adds up to 64 bits.
Some engineer on a whiteboard said, well, I did the addition. We got a 64-bit system. Not really. That was marketing speak. It was 32 bits and barely 32 bits.
The Jaguar was priced at $250 and initially sold well, moving 17,000 units with its debut. The system was boxed with a copy of Cybermorph and a single D-pad, which most critics regard as the worst controller of all time.
You had 3 buttons, and then you could call Grandma on it or dial Miss Cleo because they gave you a whole telephone keypad on this thing. It was kind of a throwback to the Intellivision controller.
The Jaguar was released nationwide in early '94, and initial sales looked good for the system. Game cartridges were ROM-based and held 6 megabytes of memory. However, many of them were just reimaginings of old titles.
Atari was a nostalgic label. I mean, all of us remembered the 2600, Atari games in the arcade, but it didn't denote high-end technology, which is what they were kind of trying to sell it on.
Then, in 1995, Atari released the console's only add-on, the Jaguar CD, in an attempt to compete with other disc-based consoles like the PlayStation and Sega Saturn.
They only ever released 15 titles for it, and it was so expensive that it did end up being a bit of a wash.
The CD peripheral only sold about 20,000 units, and many of the titles were ports like Myst and Dragon's Lair. Despite these missteps, the Jaguar would have its relative share of hits. Games like Tempest 2000, which updated the arcade tunnel shooter.
Tempest 2000 was their system seller, and it's polygons in space and shooting stuff. It had pretty graphics for the time, and the sound was okay, and it was an enjoyable game by Jaguar standards.
However, the true shining moment for the system was the first-person shooter Aliens vs. Predator.
This really was the first game that I can remember anyway that allowed you to not only play the game from 3 different perspectives, but it also offered you unique experiences.
The idea that you're going to play all 3 species, human, alien, and predator, goes back to this Atari version. This was not created with the first of the PC games.
However, by 1996, the Jaguar was written off as a loss, selling less than 250,000 units, compared to the PlayStation, which topped 100 million.
So, to put into perspective how hilariously bad the Jaguar sales were, people compare its success to the Sega Saturn, which sold a few million units.
Leftover units were sold off to various companies ranging from arcades.
Atari was able to take some of the hardware and architecture that was created for the Jaguar and sell it off to arcade divisions. Area 51 was actually powered on Jaguar technology.
to the more bizarre.
The unused systems got turned into dental cameras, inflicting more pain upon an unsuspecting populace.
By the late 90s, Atari was purchased by Hasbro, who released the rights for the system. While the Jaguar would find a little life in the modding community, it effectively ended Atari's run as a console maker.
Atari is such a strong brand, something that will so define the late 70s and the early 80s. Really showed that, that type of nostalgia hadn't kicked in yet in the early 90s. And as a result, you started to see that Atari brand slip. They don't make consoles anymore. They do make games occasionally, but something that was so prominent in people's minds has really just become sort of a novelty and something that people talk about wistfully and really never go back to play those games again.
The year 1994. Star Trek The Next Generation's exciting adventure had ended. Nirvana would go silent with the passing of Kurt Cobain, and in Japan, Sony released their first console, the PlayStation. Originally developed as an add-on for the SNES, the PlayStation housed a 32-bit CPU along with a 3D graphics processor, enabling it to push over 16 million colors with an initial resolution of 256 by 224.
Nintendo looked at the contracts and said, wait a minute, we want full control over the gaming experience. We want to decide what games are released, what peripherals are made, and exactly how they're made, and they severed the relationship with Sony.
You stay in touch, yeah?
Despite this, Sony continued to develop the PlayStation and released it stateside in September of '95. It was priced at $300, came with a single controller, and was one of the first major consoles that required a memory card to save games.
Obviously, we were used to just saving our saves onto the cartridge, but with the disc format, that wasn't as much of a possibility.
Marketing itself to a more mature audience, the PlayStation sold just under 3 million units in the US by the end of '96. Doubling that of its competition, the Sega Saturn.
Sony was known as a technology company, the Walkman, television. And so with their step into the market, it seemed to be something that felt a little bit more mature, a little bit more adult. But it just had a sexier and better marketing than Nintendo and Sega had at that time.
While several companies had their own version of a CD console, the PlayStation was the first to successfully sell it to a broader audience.
You can't underestimate that when the PlayStation came out, for a lot of people, this was the first CD-based gaming experience that they were seeing.
Sales would only continue to grow, with purchases of the system topping 50 million worldwide by 1999.
My favorite console to this day, the first PlayStation. I mean, I played Resident Evil.
Hope this is not Chris's blood.
And Tomb Raiders 1 to 3. So big, sort of like seminal games.
We've found her.
This was aided by an impressive ad campaign for the classic RPG Final Fantasy VII, which had jumped ship from Nintendo.
Final Fantasy VII was massive.
I can't shout that loudly enough. I don't even like RPG games, and yet when I saw Final Fantasy VII at a friend's house, and it was just the first cutscene in the game, I just remember it being huge and gorgeous, and I said, I need that. I want that. I went out and bought a PlayStation and Final Fantasy VII immediately.
Final Fantasy wouldn't be the only franchise to find new life on the PlayStation. Games like Castlevania and Metal Gear Solid would receive both critical and commercial acclaim on the infant system.
I think the Metal Gear Solid entry into the series for the PlayStation really established tactical espionage action, and that's something that the PlayStation again had the power to represent, mainly because for the first time you could be Solid Snake in this 3D world.
Looks like we both have a lot to learn about each other.
On top of these titles, several franchises made their debut on the PlayStation, like the vehicular shooter Twisted Metal, the arcade fighter Tekken,
Tekken 2, an amazing Tekken sort of tournaments with Nick Frost, and then we play and try and get through all the levels, beat Heihachi, and then you unlock a character. And if you got beaten, you had to wear this furry hat called the Hat of Shame.
Along with the survival horror series Resident Evil.
When you're walking down the hallway for the first time and those dogs come crashing through the window in the hallway, and that was the first time that I felt like video games could be scary.
And the tomb raiding adventures of Lara Croft.
Lara Croft was the anti-Mario for the time. I mean, yes, she had a giant, gorgeous 500 polygonal rack, but the world that you were running around in, the acrobatics that you were performing, the way the camera would move around with the character, that was something that console gamers really hadn't experienced up until that point.
But the biggest game franchise for the system was a hyper-realistic racer, Gran Turismo, selling over 10 million copies.
The depth in terms of the cars and the tracks and that attention to detail was very, very impressive at the time, despite the fact that you were just simulating an activity that most adults were already engaging in, except you could do it now with much nicer cars.
Games continued to be developed for the PlayStation up until '05 with a library of titles around 5,000, selling just under 1 billion copies worldwide. Ultimately, the PlayStation would sell over 100 million units, making it one of the best-selling consoles of all time, second only to its sibling, the PlayStation 2. By 2001, the old regime of consoles was being swept away. Atari was all but dead. The Dreamcast had been discontinued. Meanwhile, systems like the PS2 and Xbox began to take over the market, leaving Nintendo to make their stand with the GameCube. Codenamed Dolphin, the GameCube followed on the heels of the cartridge-based N64 and was Nintendo's first attempt at a disc-based console.
With cartridges, you can only have a certain amount of music. The graphics could not be as high definition. You couldn't have full motion video. There was a myriad of reasons why Nintendo had to go to a disc-based system.
The GameCube was initially released in Japan and the US in late 2001 and saw worldwide distribution by mid-2002.
But when the GameCube launched, I was working at the R-Zone at Toys R Us. Funny story about children. If you put a kiosk with a video game console up in your store, it's only a matter of time before one of those children pees on it.
It was priced at $200 and was powered by IBM's PowerPC processor and an ATI graphics card.
The console itself was adorable and it had great power on the inside. It wasn't the most powerful thing ever, but it looked good, and developers knew what they were doing with it. The color palette would pop, the worlds were vast and expansive. It was a fun console.
The GameCube required a memory card to save games, came boxed with a single controller, and like its older sibling, had 4 controller ports across the front.
The feel of the GameCube controller was awkward because it felt like you're holding like a boomerang that had these 2 little nubs on it. I always wanted to break it in half when I was playing some of their terrible games.
The GameCube sold nearly 4 million units in its first 6 months, and expectations were high that it would be another hit for Nintendo. Games were released on an 8cm mini DVD, which would only hold 1.4 gigs of data, compared to a normal DVD that could hold 8.5.
The limited storage space made it harder for developers. They couldn't pack in a ton of videos. The scores had to be cut down, and the game worlds had to be smaller.
The GameCube's CDs, not only would they get lost very easily, often not a bad coaster.
12 titles were released in the US for the system's launch, ranging from sports games to the solo adventure of Mario's brother, Luigi's Mansion.
Luigi apparently could afford a mansion on a plumber's salary, which I don't understand. I don't even think the guy that owns Roto-Rooter has a mansion.
While the GameCube had the ability for online gaming, few developers would take advantage of it, and only 4 online games were released.
This is why people don't take the Wii's online connectivity seriously. Because when Sony and Microsoft, back in the day, made an effort to get people engaged online, the GameCube was like, nope, want to keep it in the living room.
Despite this, over 600 games were released for the GameCube, with almost all of the hits being first-party titles developed by Nintendo. Games like the cel-shaded Zelda adventure Wind Waker.
The Zelda game was nice because it sort of differentiated itself entirely from the previous Zelda games. As far as the look and playability was concerned, there was 1 week and a half where I was sick from school. I really missed a lot of college credits. In fact, I never finished. Zelda has a lot to do with that.
The off-the-wall racer Mario Kart Double Dash. And, of course, the return of everyone's favorite plumber, Super Mario Sunshine.
The fluid dynamics of FLUDD, Mario's little squirty backpack thing. The graphics were gorgeous. Delfino Island popped. The colors were great. Characters were weird. It was a Mario game.
But the best-selling game for the system would be Super Smash Bros. Melee, selling just over 7 million copies.
There's no way that this game won't be a success because it takes every popular character from every Nintendo franchise and puts it into one game.
Despite these hits, sales would begin to lag, and the GameCube had its price cut in half in 2003. While it would continue to see steady sales in Japan, it never picked up worldwide. The console would top out at 22 million units sold, far below the 50 million they had anticipated to sell.
Cut!
Ultimately, the GameCube was discontinued in 2007 to make room for the motion-friendly console, the Wii.
It's sort of this odd place in the middle. It's like Star Trek 3. It's in the middle of that awesome trilogy of Star Trek movies, and you kind of have to watch it, but you don't want to watch it.
Ultimately, the GameCube underperformed. They completely skimped on online. They missed out on a storage medium with enough space to make compelling games. So Nintendo was right to sort of shelve it and move on to the Wii.
In 1988, the NES was king. Atari was all but dead, while Sega's 8-bit Master System had made a decent but small dent in the video game market, prompting Sega to take another stab with their new console, the Genesis. Initially sold in Japan as the Mega Drive, the Genesis saw its stateside launch in 1989, and was one of the world's first 16-bit consoles to hit shelves.
I got the Sega Genesis for Christmas, and I remember opening the box first because it was light enough that I thought it was a sweater, and I was like, I'm gonna get this crap out of the way first. And turns out it was a Sega, and it was awesome.
On Sega Genesis, I think that may be my all-time favorite system.
It was priced at $190 and came boxed with a single 3-button controller, along with a copy of the side-scrolling fighter Altered Beast.
When we got Sega Genesis and Altered Beast was there, that was the first time where it was like, okay, this is a whole new world, and I didn't dare close my eyes.
The conceit, of course, is that you turn into a beast. It's sort of like the Incredible Hulk, but the jumping never really worked right. But you know what? You played it anyway. You know why? Because that was the only game you had.
Sega had hoped to cash in on the success of coin-op hits like Golden Axe and Shinobi, and modeled the Genesis hardware on the architecture of arcade units to bring titles into the living room.
Because the Genesis was closer to the arcade than the Nintendo, I think a lot of parents saw this as an opportunity for them to give their kids that experience in their home without having to drop them off at the mall, without having to pick them up, without having to, provide them with all this extra money.
But despite being cheaper than the competition, the Genesis saw meager sales during its first few years, large in part to the success of the NES and the recent release of Super Mario 3. But by 1991, the winds of change were on the horizon, specifically with the debut of the world's fastest blue rodent, Sonic the Hedgehog.
Sonic the Hedgehog was the best. It was a way for me, as a fat kid, to feel fast.
Now, unfortunately for Sega, this was the same year that Nintendo released the Super Nintendo, which quickly dominated sales. Faced with this stiff competition, Sega lowered the price of the Genesis and swapped out Altered Beast with Sonic as the pack-in game. The strategy worked, and by 1992, Sega controlled 60% of the console market.
Genesis sort of set itself apart from the SNES just in its design. I mean, it was black. It was badass.
Also, the look of the Genesis was also a little bit more mature. It was a little sleeker and looked a little classier.
This, of course, was aided by an aggressive advertising campaign, along with the release of hits like The Brutal Racer, Road Rash.
Road Rash was a game where you were essentially racing rival motorcycle gangs, and they don't just stop at racing. You would get things like crowbars and chains to beat the crap out of people and eventually knock them off of their motorcycle, thusly murdering them.
Sonic the Hedgehog 2. And their impressive line of sports games, ranging from John Madden Football and NBA Jam.
He's on fire!
To what many consider to be the greatest hockey game of all time, NHL 94.
NHL 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, and forward. The EA games were phenomenal.
But one of the most successful and infamous titles was the gore-rific fighter Mortal Kombat.
I would call out of school, like I'd pretend to be sick, and then I would just stay playing Mortal Kombat with the blood code on, ABACABB, in case you need it. Go for it.
Mortal Kombat had blood, real blood. And this actually was one of the things that led to the creation of the ESRB, that people thought that there needed to be a ratings agency in order to let people know what the content of these games were.
However, by 1994, the Genesis was starting to show its age and sales began to slip as the Super Nintendo reasserted itself as king of the market. Sega attempted to extend the life of the Genesis with add-ons like the 32X and the Sega CD, but due to their high price points, these peripherals failed to catch on. Games continued to be developed until 1998. However, by 1995, Sega shifted its focus onto their new console, the Saturn. Ultimately, the Genesis sold an estimated 40 million units, 10 million less than its competitor, the Super Nintendo.
I think the Sega Genesis should really be remembered personally for people, because personally it was a really wonderful time in my life. Also, it gave us Sonic the Hedgehog, who now is an old, washed-up abomination of a franchise, but really was something special. Go Sonic.